Um, Hello and welcome everyone. There'll be people coming in, I'm sure, later. Um, I should say that the idea for this talk was very much Sohat Haji Farouqi's, who, in a very timely manner, remembered a dissertation which we had in our department and which I had been the internal examiner for, and so I had chaired. It was a dissertation which is supervised by William Galwa and Mick Dumper, and the person who wrote that dissertation is with us here. He'll be talking on that topic, but also on
I don't have an issue. Yeah.
On yeah. If I can just remind everyone to mute themselves. I want to introduce Dr. Kenny Schmitt, who finished his PhD at Exeter in 2017. And he wrote a dissertation pretty much on the title of the talk that we have advertised, which is Living Islam in Jerusalem, Faith, Conflict, and the Disputation of Religious Practice. And in particular, it was a very interesting kind of ethnography of what actually happens and the everyday, I guess, aggressions, everyday acts of resistance which happen with respect to religious practice, especially around Al-Haram al-Sharif. In particular, there was a very interesting case study of women who were bearing witness and, in a sense, acting as guardians of religious practice and of the sanctuary known as the Murabitat in this context. So that's broadly going to be what Dr. Schmidt will be talking about today. I'm also happy that this is a joint event between the Center for the Study of Islam and the European Center of Palestine Studies, because it shows ways in which our mutual research intersects, and how we have a very vibrant and exciting group of grad students who are doing projects which really cut across the different centers of research that we have within the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies. Kenny is currently a visiting professor at Al-Quds College, and has been based in Jerusalem, although today he's talking to us from the US. His current research is on Christians in Gaza, and maybe a bit later we can also ask him a few questions about his current research. So the format, as we'll have it, is that Kenny will speak for about 20 to 25 minutes. Then we will have questions and answers and a discussion. I think the best thing to do for the Q&A is you can either send your question in on the chat and I will pick it up and field the questions. If you are happy asking it in person, then please just put your hand up and I'll come to you and we will take the question orally. And also please do remember to keep your mics muted. I'm perfectly happy if people have their cameras on. In fact, it might be nice to see some faces. At the moment, the only ones I can see is myself and Kenny, and it can be a bit isolating. So please do feel free to keep your cameras on, but keep your mics off unless we ask you to unmute yourself. So I think without any further delay, let me pass the mic to Kenny, and he will give a presentation on the research that he's working on. Please, Kenny.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you, Sajad, and thank you, Suha, and thank you to the centers here. And I'm delighted to share this research. And yeah, over the past week, my email has been flooded, right, with concern. How's it going? What's happening? Give us your take, all of this. And so this invitation, though, from Exeter stood out because of my connection to the university. So yeah, to say that the past couple of weeks have been challenging might be just an understatement. And although that I am currently in the United States, my center of life is very much in Jerusalem and has been for the past 10 years, actually. So in a way, I don't feel fully present here in America or fully present there, but kind of caught between two places. And also, as I start, I'd want to point out that although I have lived there for 10 years, I'm still a guest of that city. And there may be people on this call that are Jerusalemites themselves, or people with family and personal connections that reach back generations. So I want to say to you, if I'm missing something or you have something to share or add to this, I would love to hear from you, and we would benefit all of us from your perspective. And so for this, as Sajjad said, for this presentation, I want to draw out some of the findings from my PhD and use them to kind of think critically and reflexively about the current status of what's happening in Jerusalem, Israel, and Palestine. And so in that work, I make a theoretical argument about the process of meaning making through Muslim ritual performances. And I want to focus specifically on what's been happening in Sheikh Jarrah, as well as at the Haram al-Sharif, and their role in the development of the political unrest for the past few weeks. But before we get into the details of those developments, I want to lay out the theoretical model and provide a bit of historical context. And to do that, I'm actually going to share my screen here to share with you just a couple of pictures. All right. Can people see the screen? All right, good. I'm going to adjust one thing on my end. Okay, great. So this research began with a question that I'd like to illustrate with 3 pictures. And so this first picture here, there we go. It may look like a routine Muslim prayer, right? It happens to be Friday noon prayer during Ramadan of 2014 after the khutbah. And so I would ask you, what does this prayer mean? And now if I zoom out to the second picture, you'll notice that the prayer is also taking place in Jerusalem, home of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holy site in Islam. So, and it's somewhat curious that the prayer is not happening inside the mosque, as you might expect, rather it's some distance away on the Mount of Olives. And notice too that there are soldiers with police barricades standing on the right side watching the prayers. So they are there preventing these men from going down the hill and back up into the mosque itself. The officers are physically restricting the men from accessing the holy site. And now, the third picture, what does this mean, this prayer? So this is the same thing, only moments later, the same situation. So tear gas has been fired, people are scattering, pushing to getting away, covering their ears from the bang. And if you look closely, there's in the right corner, there's 2 people that actually are continuing to pray. So here's my question. What does it mean to perform Friday prayer here, in this place, at this time? And so clearly, there are many dynamics in play, and we're going to talk about politics and religion and sacred space and occupation and settler colonialism. And there's also these social, on the ground, bottom up lived dynamics going on that we need to consider as well. So I'll do my best to highlight various parts of this as I proceed here. So now I want to start with an obvious and important dynamic. Right, these men wanted to pray in Al-Aqsa Mosque, but they were prevented. So their ritual was disrupted. And so for this research, I spent 5 years conducting ethnographic interviews, participant observation in the city. And one thing that I noticed was that the disruptions like these happened regularly, right? When Muslims are blocked from prayer at Al-Aqsa Mosque, like this example, they experience a physical and spatial disruption. In other cases, disruptions may be temporal, when they're delayed at checkpoints in Ramadan and arrive late for an iftar meal. Disruptions also occur when the volume of the adhan, right, the call to prayer, is restricted. Another example, maybe the musaharati, right? These are the people who awake other Muslims for the pre-dawn meal, suhoor, in Ramadan. These musaharati have been arrested for disturbing settlers. So the larger project includes other examples, but I will omit them here. We could maybe talk about others in the chat if you want later, but I'll summarize. So the disruption of a ritual can be physical or spatial, temporal or pervasive, acute or diffuse, oral or institutional. And they show that Muslims who desire to perform rituals in Jerusalem are rarely granted guaranteed the ability to act on their intention, at least not routinely. So disruption is thus the first analytical through line of my study. And beyond noting their ubiquity in Jerusalem, I also argue that ritual disruptions create an apt opportunity to challenge and extend theoretical discourse on ritual theory. Why? Because typical treatments of ritual from a theoretical perspective overlook or include an implicit and unquestioned assumption. And that assumption being that people who intend to perform a ritual have the means to complete it. That's not always the case in Jerusalem. So this provides us an opportunity. So ritual disruption creates this inroad to theoretical discussion. Now, let me make 3 points here about disruption that are critical to this study. The first is perception, right? How the disruptions are perceived are critical to how the disruption and the ritual adaptations are interpreted, right? For example, you could have a baby crying, right, while someone's trying to pray. And so this disruption is likely to be interpreted as harmless, right? Maybe even cute. But if the disruption is being enforced at gunpoint, that disruption will be perceived completely different. So perception is critical. Second is we need to address the question, how do Muslims in Jerusalem perceive the disruptions of their religious practices in Jerusalem? And very simply, the disruptions, they perceive them as being driven by Israel's settler colonial project in the city. Now, this is something I was told and told often and encountered repeatedly. And so whether those disruptions were physical or spatial, temporal or pervasive, and so forth, they were somehow related in a broad sense to settler colonialism. Now, are there other disruptions in the city that are not rooted in settler colonialism? Yes, obviously. I mean, for example, someone can forget to turn off their cell phone during a prayer, right? This would also be a type of ritual disruption. But once you start looking for disruptions, in fact, you find that they occur quite often. But in the context of Jerusalem, settler colonialism is a critical issue, right? And many of you will be familiar with the work of Patrick Wolf, where he makes that important observation that settler colonialism is a structure and not just an event. So the disruption, let me pause. I'll finish the paragraph. My headphones are dying here. So the disruption of Muslim religious practices in Jerusalem is part of a larger structure of disruption that impacts all domains of Palestinian life, not just ritual performance. And very quickly, we'll notice how those different domains intersect and overlap. So pause 2 seconds. I need to turn off my Bluetooth.
Okay, can you still hear me? Yeah, okay, great, thank you. That was less disruptive than I thought it would be. Okay, so the The third thing I want to say about disruptions, and it's that disruptions do not compel or elicit specific responses. Rather, they make affordances or opportunities for creative human agency. So just because someone is blocked from access to Al-Aqsa Mosque, they're not forced to respond in a particular way. Maybe they'll go and try to enter from a different gate. Maybe they decide to go pray at home. Maybe they decide not to pray at all. Maybe they pray right where they were stopped, right? Maybe they hear about the block and choose not to go in the first place, right? Maybe they hear about the block and come precisely because of the block, right? So after the disruption or the perception of a disruption, the choice is theirs about how they act. And it creates an opportunity for them to choose what they do next. And so this leads to the second analytical through line of the study, and my main contention. And that's when rituals are disrupted, opportunities are created for improvisations. And I build the case for improvisation by discussing the performative dimensions of rituals and the heuristics of analogies. So religious rituals, like the performances of skilled jazz musicians, they're both spontaneous and responsive, but they're practiced and deliberate also. So ritual spontaneity occurs when Muslims make physical or bodily, even discursive adjustments. And the practice dimension emerges by an appeal to an established repertoire of themes that, in the case of Jerusalem, includes the discursive tradition of Islam, sacred space, nationalism, resistance, local culture, and geography. So it's both practiced and spontaneous. These things are combined here. But it's not enough just to say that it's responsive or practice. How are the rituals then perceived as authentic or appropriate expressions? And as I researched, I noticed that some improvisations were better at speaking back to the disruptions than others, that they were somehow more credible, that there was more widespread agreement that the community considered them appropriate. So I account for these differences with the notion of resonance. And this is the third analytical through line of the study. So resonance explains improvisational effect, why some improvisations connect culturally or emotionally, and why others fall flat. So back to the Friday prayer example, the ritual is clearly disrupted by the police blockade and the firing of the tear gas. There's an improvisational dimension because the Muslims praying they've made both physical and discursive adjustments. The physical adjustments are easy to spot, right? They're praying outside of the mosque when their intention was to pray within it. They may choose, the fact that they've chosen to pray right outside the police barricade is a spatial disruption, but there's also a discursive disruption. And this barricade has created an affordance, or presented the opportunity for the ritual to become an act of protest. So not only are they praying to God, they are protesting the blockade. They may even view their prayer as challenging the occupation or the settler colonial state. And so these differences in meanings are easily expressed simultaneously and in accord and in harmony, since the symbolic properties of rituals include multivocality and condensation of meaning. This is where the resonance enters, right? These Muslims are drawing from an established repertoire of themes within Palestinian society, right? Islam, sacred space, protest, active nonviolent resistance, all of these things are all related to the idea of posing, shaking off the occupation. And these themes resonate deeply within Palestinian society. And so therefore it affirms that the prayer is performed in a legitimate and appropriate way. The disruptions presented a discursive challenge, right? Aside from obstructing the affective, right, the emotional, bodily, collective value of praying in the sacred space, the barricades also have prevented them from receiving the increased blessing, spiritual blessing, right? The 500 hasanat of praying in the sacred space itself. So the community's improvised a solution, right? If someone intends, if they have the niyyah to pray in the mosque, but is prevented by Israel, by a soldier, whatever, the blessings are still accorded. So temporary periodic disruptions lead to lasting performative and discursive adjustments. But you may be wondering, like, what happens like next week or maybe next month when the barricade is lifted and they return to the mosque without disruption? Does the utility of the metaphor of improvisation fade? I would argue that no, the conceptual and the heuristic value remains. And that's because the effect of the disruptions are felt long after they're taken away. In this case, when Israel began imposing the access restrictions, think about the first, it happened to be young men praying in front of these barricades in this way. They're seen as these true innovators. But since these spatial disruptions have become somewhat expected, and because Israel imposes them whenever political tensions arise in the city, this form of barricade prayer happens somewhat routinely. So the ongoing resonance of the improvised ritual has allowed it to assimilate into the broader repertoire of Muslim ritual performances in Jerusalem. So that's how the argument works. I'm working primarily with the concepts of disruption, improvisation, and resonance to explain the process of meaning making through ritual performance. And I could have, again, easily shared other case studies where we observe different levels of resonance, a couple that even have dissonance, and how they kind of work for this process of meaning making. But I chose to share this study in particular because of its relevance for what's been happening over the past week. And I don't have time here right now to recount all of the developments of the past weeks, right? The bombing in Gaza, the civilian casualties, the rockets out of Gaza, the clashes in various cities throughout Israel and elsewhere, right? International demonstrations. I mean, you can follow the news for the play-by-play. I find it personally quite dizzying and disorienting, being so personally tied into this space, checking on friends and all of the rest. So my interest here is about the rituals, right? How have they been linked into this current crescendo of unrest? And as I begin to link here, I want to make a caveat that I don't mean to imply that the entire cause of what is happening right now is directly caused by ritual disruptions, okay? The disruption of prayer at Al-Aqsa, what's been happening in Sheikh Jarrah, these have played a part, but they're not the only thing, right? We could have another discussion, a broader discussion about settler colonialism, its logics. We could talk about kind of the calculations of key players in the political field and their interests in the conflict and how it, basically keeps Netanyahu in power, and a number legitimates Hamas and their presence, and we could talk about that maybe later. But ritual has been an important part, though not the only part. So one key thing to look at is, right, we've just come out of Ramadan, right? And if you've watched the news, you've seen that there have been these protests and clashes, even before the big stuff, happening at Damascus Gate, right? Damascus Gate is on the north side of the old city. It's this beautiful area with an amphitheater, and it leads right into the heart of the Muslim quarter. It's one of the main thoroughfares right to the Haram al-Sharif. It also happens to be, if you're coming from the north, the main avenue down to the Wailing Wall. I mean, it's a key artery for the community, and Israel had been blocking this area, preventing people, Palestinian Muslims, from congregating in this area. And that's notable because it's one of the few public spaces that informal social interaction can happen. And particularly in a time like Ramadan, where that's a critical part of the experience is being with friends and family and breaking fast together and going down to Al-Aqsa for Taraweeh prayers. It's a critical space, right? But they're being prevented from access there. Another key kind of precipitating factor is you might have heard about what was happening with Jerusalem Day. Jerusalem Day is this Jewish nationalistic holiday where it's the celebration of the unification of Jerusalem. And it often implies marches right down to the Damascus Gate and through the old city. Flags waving, Israeli flags, chants, death to Arabs, these kind of things, very provocative. And it kind of centers around the Damascus Gate area. So that's happening all in the background. And then we have Sheikh Jarrah enter, right? This is a Palestinian neighborhood in Jerusalem, just north of the old city. And these homes have been under settler attack since 1972. That's longer than most of us have been alive, right? Settler group began angling to displace the residents so that settler Jewish groups could take over. And the case has come into the news occasionally over the past few decades as it's made its way through the Israeli courts. But the immediate precipitating factor really came back in October of 2020 when the Israeli Supreme Court ruled that 4 of the families that live there must surrender their residence before May 2nd, right? That was the final deadline. Otherwise, they would be expelled. So pressure began to lead up build in the lead up to that deadline. And
Kenny, sorry to interrupt. You're not actually sharing a PowerPoint with them. I'm just wondering if you thought you were sharing a PowerPoint.
I am not. I'm about to show another picture. Yep.
Okay, sure. All right.
Yeah.
I was just checking. Okay, no problem. Sorry.
No problem. So the Sheikh Jarrah example is a clear example of Israel's ongoing dispossession of Palestinians from their homes, from their lands, right? The ongoing Nakba. And this dispossession is part of that settler colonial project, embedded right in government, legal, military, cultural productions. It's not simply this one-off event, right? This is part of the structure. Now, it's very easy to see how the threat of these expulsions constitute a disruption. But if you're listening closely, you may wonder, well, how does ritual enter this per se? It's not directly linked. People are being expelled from their homes, right? But I would argue that rituals are important in this case because at one point, these families, a number of years ago actually, had the idea that they could raise awareness about their situation and protest their expulsion by doing what? By hosting iftar at their home outside in public view. And so they drew from the powerful symbolic properties of the ritual to generate this cultural resonance, to place a spotlight on their situation. And thus, the disruptive nature of their threatened expulsion, although not directly linked to ritual initially, created an affordance to improvise with the ritual performance and create meaning. But let's not stop there, right? What happened, and I now actually have a picture I can share with you. There we go. This is a picture of one of the iftars that was just several days ago. I'll leave that up for a minute here. But let's not stop there. On May 6th, right, just a couple weeks ago, during one of these iftar meals, settlers who had taken over one of the buildings across the street began throwing rocks, glass bottles, and other various objects at the people breaking fast together. Now, unsurprisingly, the situation spiraled out of control, right? People began throwing, they weren't compelled, right? They were given an affordance, it created an opportunity, and they chose to throw rocks back. Fire broke out, things went out of control. There were arrests and so forth. So this ritual was actually disrupted so fully that its performance was never really recovered. And now the following day, May 7th, right, the focus shifts from Sheikh Jarrah back to the Haram al-Sharif, the noble sanctuary. And this day happened to be Friday, and the fourth Friday of Ramadan, right, one of the most sacred days in the Islamic calendar year. And so in Jerusalem, each Friday of Ramadan attracts large numbers of people to come to perform the noon prayers. And each successive Ramadan Friday attracts more people. Many come from the West Bank, even when Israel permits them. They come from farther than that also. And on any given Friday in Ramadan, there can be upwards of 100,000 people present on the Haram al-Sharif. And so on the Friday we were discussing, I've understood that there was about 70,000 people, which is a huge number. And so they don't just come on Fridays for the noon prayers, they also come for Taraweeh. And many also come for i'tikaf, right? This is the practice of typically performed at the end of Ramadan, of staying in the mosque or a sacred space to perform ibadat, right? Or pious acts, right? Maybe it's reading the Quran, it's supplementary prayers, devotional practices. And so to appreciate what's happening here in Jerusalem over this past week, I think we need to just pause and have a bit of a comment about the complexities and challenges of pilgrimage practices in urban space, okay? So I'll quickly advertise. I wrote an article about this called Jerusalem's Ramadan Fridays, right? Pilgrimage through the bottlenecks of occupation, where I discuss this issue in detail. And if anyone wants a copy, send me an email. I'm glad to pass it along. But the main point here is think about managing the flow of people and the logistical work required in making a pilgrimage happen from an urban point of view. Now, this is true of most pilgrimage sites, right? Just another example comes from Israel-Palestine. Last month, panic struck a crowd of Orthodox Jews at the annual pilgrimage of Lag BaOmer at Mount Meron in the north of Israel, while worshipers were passing through a tight corridor. What happened? 45 people were killed in a stampede and 150 were injured, right? And this tragedy was caused only by the fact of the logistical failures of the Israeli security forces who were managing the pilgrimage experience. And this happened when it was Jews managing a pilgrimage experience for Jews. So what happens when it's Muslims performing a pilgrimage and the people managing the flow are Israeli security forces, right? The military manifestation of settler colonialism and occupation. So as people make their way to Al-Aqsa, the flow of foot traffic, it jostles, it slows, they pass through these tight corridors. Israeli forces are on high alert. It's tense from the previous day's events in Sheikh Jarrah. Many Muslims perceive Israel's presence in the city as fundamentally illegitimate, right? If we're going to go back to the perception of a disruption, right? Is it perceived legitimately or illegitimately, right? That has a huge impact in the way people respond to it. And another key point to point out here is when people are coming to Al-Aqsa, to the Haram al-Sharif, it's not Muslims who decide who can come and go from the compound. It's actually Israeli soldiers and border guards. And so this has been the situation since 1967. And they, at any point, can deny entry to someone for entering the mosque. And we could, maybe in the Q&A, we could talk about kind of the erosion, or this thing they've called the status quo, in its erosion. But you could imagine this scenario, almost 100,000 people coming in. I haven't even yet mentioned Laylatul Qadr, right? The night of power, right? This happens to be the following day, May 8th. And even more people come to spend time in the mosque, right? in some years, Laylatul Qadr will attract upwards of 400,000 people, right? When I was there, I believe it was 2015, 400,000 people up there. You can imagine when the political tensions are flaring, people are passing through tight corridors, trying to get through. Israeli soldiers are the ones managing the flow, even though they might put great effort into making that process seamless or easy. I mean, that might happen on a broad scale, but you have individual interactions, bumps, tussles, jostles, all these things happening. So it's no wonder that it's such a tinderbox. And so we saw on the 10th of May that Israeli forces had been storming and interrupting the Tarawih prayers for several days previous to that. And they came in even in more full force on the 10th. From what I've read, some 300 people were injured in these protests. Right, here's a picture. Here's another one. And these disruptions are very powerful, and they have this affordance that's built into them that creates an opportunity. And now we could have a discussion about who uses those opportunities, how are they instrumentalized, maybe politicians, maybe different actors, but no less, this is the background, the context, the way that rituals can be used, utilized, co-opted in Jerusalem. And they have played a significant part in the development of the tensions today. So with that, I will end, and thank you for listening, and I look forward to having some Q&A. Stop share.
Thank you, Kenny. I think that's probably given us quite a lot to think about. As I mentioned before, if people do have questions or comments, you can either put them in the chat, or you can put your hand up and we'll come to take it orally. There was one comment earlier which was asking what happens when Jews pray at Al-Buraq, and but it's allowed despite the continuous disturbance it causes to Muslim prayers and people who are living and working around it. If you can see that in the chat, can you see that?
Okay, yeah, let me look in the chat here. So.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I'll just say generally that the concepts of disruption, improvisation, resonance, this is not unique to Muslim ritual experience. You could also observe similar things in, right, what could happen with the disruption of prayers at Al-Buraq, right? We know from history that at different times stones have been thrown down on people worshiping there, other things. So disruptions can happen in those ways as well. So the main thrust of the argument is very much grounded in the theoretical contribution. I don't know if that gets at it more fully enough, but that at least is a start.
I mean, it's also like the example you gave, you know, of the pilgrimage in the north, and you know, structurally the different way in which you can have disruptions in both cases, but of course there is perhaps a question of attitude or approach when it comes to security forces dealing with Jewish worshippers, which is not the case with Arab, Christian, or Muslim worshippers.
Yeah, that's right. Who is managing the flow is critical, right? I remember several interviews, Jerusalemites saying tongue-in-cheek, like, if you left this to us, it would be a disaster, right? Poking fun at their own people of their, you know, ability to coordinate and all that. Now, I'm not going to put too much stock in that, like, either way. I think it was mainly a silly comment, but regardless of who the people are that are managing the flow, it's still a logistical challenge. Could be a nightmare, in fact, right? How do you do this? And yeah, you would observe this in India. I mean, I've been in several conferences where we've talked about pilgrimage comparatively in an urban context. And this is very much an issue that's relevant across the board.
There is a question in the chat about how the British dealt with the issue before. Are you familiar with historical examples?
Yeah, I don't know the precise details. I will say that it's important to note, particularly at the Haram al-Sharif, that Palestinians in living memory, particularly Jerusalemites, will speak of before 67, the fact that Muslims and Christians would go up to the Haram al-Sharif together, right? You can find older Christians in the city that will talk about having picnics up there, enjoying, the afternoon. It's a nice open spot. And so that is something that the British allowed, but I don't have my head around the details if there's specific instances of times that it was blocked. But the fact that it is managed and controlled the way it is very much a contemporary issue based on 1967 and Israel's occupation.
I think there's a question from William.
Hi, Kenny. Thank you so much for this really great talk and fantastic to see you. I had a question about some of your more recent work and how it intersects with the ideas that you presented today. How does the situation of Christians in Gaza and the difficulties that they have with regard to ritual and the practice of faith compare with the examples that you've used today from the Jerusalem context?
Perfect. Thank you, William, and it's great to see you as well. Yeah, this is how this worked, right? Those of you in academia, established professors and such, you understand how kind of one thing leads to the next. The students who are kind of getting acquainted with this, I can attest personally that this is how it works. So I mentioned this article I wrote about the urban dimensions of pilgrimage practices, right? And I was focused on bottlenecks. And one of those bottlenecks was the Kalandia checkpoint, specifically for Muslims coming from the north of the West Bank. Kalandia is the main checkpoint in which Palestinians can enter into Jerusalem or Israel. And there's a whole permit regime that's developed around managing people's access to the city. So what happens is that what I argue in the paper is that this is one of the primary bottlenecks. And it's a complete disaster for all of the reasons that Kalandia is a disaster. And it's a kind of artificially imposed disruption and bottleneck that's framed around this permit regime. And so as I was looking into the details of the permit regime, I began wondering, are there other examples where people must apply for a permit to go on a pilgrimage experience? Now, there's an obvious one, right? There's a quota system in Saudi of how many Muslims from each country can come in, right? So there's some sort of kind of structure regime around managing who can come and how many. But I noticed that with the historic Christian presence in Gaza, given the blockade that's been in place since 2007, they, in order to come to Jerusalem or to Bethlehem for Easter and Christmas, they have had to apply for permits in order to be given access, granted permission to leave. And so I began tracking down some of these Gazan Christians and asking them questions about this, right? Because their permissions are somehow they're linked to the Orthodox Church, or the Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, the Catholic Church, the Latin Church, and so I began discovering not only were these permits the mechanism by which they could access the holy sites. It's never been a given that Israel would grant them permission. They can be, denied on security grounds at any point. And so this was really exciting to me. I mean, not like from a human perspective, it was horrible and I hated it for this community. But research-wise, one of the things that I found out was that many of these Muslims were Christians were using the pilgrimage permits as a mechanism to escape Gaza permanently, right? How do you migrate out of Gaza? You've got to get out somehow. So the Christian population as of 2007 was about 4,000 people. Today, there's 600 or 700 only. And almost all of those 3,000-ish people who have migrated have done so using these pilgrimage permits. And I could get more into the details of that, but the last thing I'll say is that article led to a research proposal of a social history of this entire community. And that's what I've been mainly focused on, because very few people are aware that Christians have even had a meaningful presence in Gaza. And in fact, they've, upwards of 10% of the population at the close of the British Mandate. There's lots of things I could say about what they have done and contributions they've made. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for the question, William.
Thanks. We've got a question from Mustafa.
Hi, thanks for giving me the chance to ask the questions. So I didn't get all of the talk. Sorry, I had some problems getting in, but what I did catch is quite fascinating. I'm interested more in the idea of different modes of resistance, which are not necessarily violent. And it appears to me that before these things get violent, there are other forms of protest, and one of those especially ritual protests, which I find very, very interesting, protesting through various forms of ritual. And then when there are, obstructions in place or they are set upon or they are attacked upon, and then we see things start to get violent, not necessarily in the same place, but probably from Gaza. I got the bit where you were talking about the iftar, and that was a kind of the open iftar and the public iftar as a public representation of protest. Can I just ask, in Sheikh Jarrah itself, did any kind of things take place? So I think what you were saying that they happened in Al-Quds. So in Sheikh Jarrah, what were the kind of means of resisting and protest to these expulsions that were going on? Were there these kind of ritual protests happening there, or were you saying they're happening in actually in the center of Jerusalem, around Al-Aqsa and other places? So just kind of a clarification there. Thanks.
Yeah, the answer is simple. It's both and. The picture, Mustafa, I showed of the iftar was actually taken from Sheikh Jarrah. They had been hosting iftars quite regularly, and this acting as a way of gathering support, showing solidarity, protesting, all of the rest. And it's important to note that the disruption, okay, yes, on May 6th, people threw stones at this group who were having iftar and all the rest, things went crazy. But to experience the effect of the disruption, you don't have to be physically present there, right? So this is, in some ways, was a trigger for protests that were also happening at the Haram al-Sharif, because people were so incensed that such a thing would happen. So both and thank you for the question.
Thanks.
I was just wondering, Soha, do you want to ask your question, or should we just look at the chat?
Well, I mean, I can ask it. It's
Yeah,
Kenny, sure. Thank you. I just think in terms of going back to the Haram al-Sharif, could you share with us a little bit about the way in which the complex is managed, that sort of tripartite arrangement between Israel, Jordan, and the local Waqf, I think it is. But with a view particularly to commenting now, looking back on what's just happened there at the end of Ramadan, I mean, how tenable is it, in your view? Is it any more a matter of urgency than it always has been, or is it just going to rumble on as it is, do you think? Thanks.
My quick reaction to that is it's likely to rumble along as it is. And that's, yeah, okay, so let me unpack that a little bit more. Prior to 1967, we have the custodians of the sacred spot being the Hashemites, right? And these are now in Jordan. And if you remember from 48 to 67, Jordan, this is the West Bank, is a part of broader Jordan. And so they are controlling, managing custodians of the sacred sites. And when Israel occupied Jerusalem in 1967, it's important to note that they did not destroy the Qubbat Sahra. They didn't destroy the Dome of the Rock. They didn't destroy the mosque. There were a few calls for that, right? But ultimately they backed off, and they blinked, right? Sometimes you say that. And they decided to allow the Hashemites to continue managing the sacred compound, but having their access being managed by the Israeli soldiers. And that has kind of come to be known as the status quo. And I'll point out that this status quo is different than the status quo when you're talking about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and other sacred properties that were developed in the late Ottoman period to manage the administration of sacred sites. So this is a new thing. People often confuse those. And so that's in 67. You have these two kind of another report negotiating kind of live in this sort of haphazard way, who does what, who has what roles and responsibilities. And it's not in writing, it's not official, it's just kind of this, okay, we're not, at arms, but we're still kind of working it out. The Palestinians come in to the picture later, right, during the Oslo period and the establishment of the Palestinian Authority and all of that, and they wrestle some control from the Jordanians, and so they enter this space to also begin playing a role. And again, to emphasize that these three parties have had, nothing is formal, it's all kind of on the ground making it up. And this is what's important, why that's important, right? Netanyahu or whatever, Israeli official will say, well, we maintain the status quo, right? We are true guardians of that. But very few people, the public doesn't actually know that this set of understandings is informal. Like, until only the last couple of years, someone has even actually written down a general kind of contents of what that understanding would be. Finally, I'll note we've not even mentioned, and it is critical to mention here, is right, the Haram Sharif is also the Temple Mount, right? This is the historic place of the temples. Right after Israel occupied East Jerusalem, the rabbinic authorities got together to discuss whether it would be permitted or not for Jews to access that spot. They said it was forbidden. This prohibition is eroded over time. And there's a whole separate story about kind of the changing dynamics within Israel society, adding increased interest and pressure on that site, right? We have the Morabitat phenomenon that we mentioned very briefly. I've written on that, a couple papers, very much coming as a protest and response to those kind of increasing emphases in Israeli society and direct activism on changing the status quo. So all of that, when you ask me, is it just kind of simmer and keep, this is what goes on in my head when someone asks me about that. I don't see, it's possible that there will be changes, but we'll wait and see. So thank you, Suha, for your question. I'll end with that, yeah.
Kenny, can I just ask a clarification? So what I mean, just to take up the question of the distribution of responsibilities, I mean, what does the Waqf or the Hashemites actually control?
Yeah, today, very little. Early on, it was more, right? Israel is very interested in what's going on underneath the surface there. And so, for example, you have something as simple as a water pipe, right, for a water fountain. And the maintenance and operation of that have been under the control of the Hashemites. But now, Israel is very concerned about, oh, well, if you kind of change a water pipe or you do this or that, you know, what's going to be uncovered, what's going to be destroyed. There's important developments led by the Islamic movement of Israel in the mid 1990s with the restoration of the Musalla Marwani, the Solomon Stable. It has various names. The Marwan Prayer Hall underneath the surface. The Jordanians were not involved in that. This was initiated by Palestinians within Israel. Yeah, so basically I'm kind of giving examples of the eroding role of the Jordanians at the site. But they still very much have a vested interest. They have done a lot of financing. They pay the bill for a lot of the Waqf employees who are managing safety, security on the compound itself. So there are active roles that they do have, but they are changing, shifting, and eroding.
So Jack, can I just come back in on that very, very briefly to Kenny?
Yes,
but we can safely, yeah, so we can assume that there would have been high-level interventions on the part of the Jordanians at the end of Ramadan. I mean, we can assume that. Oh
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And it's part of, right, I mean, Jordan is this changing country with, you know, all kinds of pressures of its own. And one of the kind of important legitimizing pieces of that regime is their role of custodians of the sacred sites. So Jordan is very interested in preserving their role there as a source of legitimacy for their own regime. So they're going to invest resources as well.
There are a couple of questions in the chat. So I take the first one, which I'm not entirely sure I understand, but does Israel's administration practice systematic intervention to attack syncretic practices? I'm not sure I understand the question, but maybe that means more to you.
Syncretic? Do you mean syncretistic? I don't. Yeah, I don't know if I understand it either.
If the person who asked the question, if you could.
I think it's about syncretic cultures. As we see, when you talked about Christians and Muslims or even Jews, whoever sharing a space and celebrating festivals together or whatever, without having much division as individual communities. I was thinking a little aloud in the sense that whether the state is, Israeli state is intervening to stop such inter-religious amity to continue. That was my intention.
Great. Yeah, I got it now. Thank you. This question, in fact, is an opening to a door to an entire other case study that I've worked on, which is Sufism in Jerusalem. And I won't get into the details, but just kind of the headlines. is that, so there's different Sufi brotherhoods that have been in Israel-Palestine historically, who historically were seen as, against the occupation, or like not partners, they're backwards, barbaric, all of this, Orientalist stuff that they've been pulled into. But, and they too have been disrupted tremendously by 1948, 1967. But several institutions have remained, and a couple of them have taken a more conciliatory approach to the Jewish state, and not just the state directly, but being willing to have like things like interfaith dialogue. One group, the Naqshbandiya, who is primary leader, has now passed. He was very active in peace initiatives and using the whole kind of momentum of the Oslo period and grassroots, social mobilization to bring about peace, and framing that in a ritual way through Muslims and Jews participating in rituals together. So towards your point about the systematic interventions or systematic disruptions, these disruptions, I've argued, work in the opposite way, where the Israeli government has courted these communities and said, in a way instrumentalizing them and saying, look, this is the good Islam. But yet it's caused problems within the Palestinian Muslim community itself, because that willingness to engage in partnerships and discussions and all the rest is seen as an affront to the broader Muslim community. So the disruption is still there. The improvisation is still there by creating these shared rituals that build this shared experience, but the resonance falls flat. So I could say more on that later, but if you want, but that's the basic idea. So yes, it's there, but it's just kind of configured differently.
Thanks. We have another question from Adam Lane in the chat. Is it clear that disruptions were happening at Al-Aqsa during Ramadan as a way to undermine the protests of the residents of Sheikh Jarrah? If so, could you please talk about the paradigmatic aspect of the Israeli army's superiority complex here as a way to emphasize the inferiority of Muslims through disruption? Is the Israeli army using ritual as a hostage? I love that, yeah.
Say again?
There's quite a lot there, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Are they using it as a hostage? I mean, my sense of it is that there's this kind of confidence, right? Of this is our city, it's our capital, we manage it, you're here because we're nice, kind of an attitude. And so you should be grateful that we even let you come and pray. This kind of an attitude, so quite condescending, quite dismissive, but also like, we don't want to, open this big can and spark off this unrest. So we do want to kind of keep the peace and all of that, but you have different registers, right? You have, maybe someone who's thinking strategically at a kind of political level, but you have, managers, administrators who are maybe thinking tactically, how do we manage this stuff? And then you have people, kind of foot soldiers at the bottom who are actually bumping up into people and making real-time decisions and are, offended by something, or someone spits at them, or, like, you can't say what happens in all of these little micro exchanges, but they're all there because the spaces can be so tight. And any one of these kind of things can be a trigger, right? I remember vividly when I was working with the Murabitat, and some of them had been kicked out of the compound itself, and they were protesting right outside the gates. I'm standing beside them, and out walks a group of Jewish right-wing extremists who are attempting to pray on the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount. And these women are enraged because this is a complete affront to their sensibilities. It's also against rabbinic rules, all the rest. And like, whoa, things got dicey quick. And so those types of things can often be the way these things unravel, let's say. And I'll say one more comment about Adam, your question, it's just really good, is one of the things that I have not done yet that would be worthwhile is to go back and listen to the speeches that are being given over the past couple of weeks, and particularly, you know, May 8th, 9th, 10th, 7th, all around there. Like, what are leaders saying about what's happening? I know very often that these speeches include, you know, discussion of current events. So I would be, let's say it this way, I would be surprised if they weren't talking about Sheikh Jarrah from the front, and that playing a role in linking the protests between the two different spaces.
Thank you. I'm just wondering if there is, are there any final kind of question, comment that anyone has? Because I think we might bring this to a close.
I've just put my email in the chat. If anyone wants to follow up, I'm happy to share articles and that sort of things. Those sort of things, you can find me on academia as well.
There is this one comment from Nibal Khalil that the disruption of rituals is a continuous process and not exceptional in Ramadan. And it's, yeah, I mean, we've talked about how this is an expression of brutality, settler colonialism, of course. It's a political posture, I guess you could say, but political action.
I can ask a quick thing if you like. I mean, it's probably too big of a thing if there's a bit of time.
Well, yeah, let's. If it's brief, yeah. I mean, there's no
I
harm.
don't know. Yeah, it could be brief. It could be very long. I mean, I think somebody did say this, that do you see in your view that things are actually much worse, and there is a greater state of despair? That's the way it appears to me. And in terms of strategy, I guess just as a very broad point, somewhat for us to, you know, a take-home point in terms of strategy about people wanting to know what can they do. Or how do you see, you know, some kind of way out of this and some hope? Can you say anything general as a closing remark? I know it's a very big thing to say.
Yeah, yeah. Two very quick things to say. I actually remember about a month ago when I started looking for it was maybe 6 weeks, for my own planning of oh, what am I going to do when, you know, and I'm sticking different dates and holidays in the calendar. And I noticed that a number of these are coming together quite closely. And I thought, oh man, things are gonna happen in Jerusalem this year because these holidays are too scrunched up together. Because as you know, Ramadan, you know, progresses earlier according to the Gregorian calendar each year. So they shift. My guess is in terms of the rituals and their role in kind of sparking or perpetuating what's happening now, Ramadan is over, right? The Eid is finished. You have Shavuot, the Israeli holiday, happening now. That's going to be interesting, but my sense is that once kind of the sacred calendar for these different communities kind of just roll along, that at least this part of the driver of the conflict will cool back down a little bit. Now, that's not to, you know, talking about Gaza and rockets and airstrikes and all the rest. That's a whole different thing, and very much worth watching closely. So yeah, in a sentence, the ritual component of this is likely to kind of take a back seat now and going forward, at least for the time being.
Thanks.
Thank you, Kenny. And I think what we will certainly do in the future is maybe have you come back and talk to us about your current project on the Christians in Gaza, both historically and also now, because it's certainly an area of research which I wasn't aware of, and I'm sure there are others who are not terribly aware of it. So it'd be wonderful to hear more about that, and keep kind of the links between what the Center for Study of Islam does with the European Center for Palestine Studies. So looking forward to that. Thank you again, Kenny. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. And I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you will continue watching this space and keeping up the active engagement with what's going on at the moment. So thank you once again, and hopefully see you at our next event.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you for hosting me, and take care. Thanks for participating, everybody.
Yes. Thank you.